Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and today I've Coach Kassem Hansen back on the podcast. He is from N1 Training and Nutrition. If you aren't aware of those guys, you definitely will want to search them up after today because we deep dive into all things range of motion. Specifically, this spawned from the research that recently came out from Dr. Milo Wolf and Dr. Pack, who are on the podcast just recently. And we dive into some of the limitations and confounders that you need to be aware of when viewing this research, because there were plenty, and I was concerned that many people were taking home the wrong message from this research, and they didn't fully understand some of those limitations, confounders, and things to be aware of so that you're applying the research properly to your situation. And so we dive into all of that. And I think it's going to be a real important podcast if you listen to the one with Dr. Pack, Dr. Milo, to give you a bit of a further in-depth understanding of that research and research in general, but particularly the range of motion research, such as comparing like-for-like exercises and trying to find the best exercise for a certain muscle group and why that's a fallacy. So many good take-homes from listening to Kassem here, so definitely look forward to that. And as a reminder, guys, here at Revive Stronger, we are coaches ourselves. We're helping our clients pick exercises that are complementary, going to build muscles maximally. And these are the people we love to help. And something that we always make sure to do with our online coaching is keep it personal. That's one of the things that's most important to us, is making sure that you can communicate to us effectively and we can communicate back to you. You can get a knowledge base from our coaching too, so you can take away everything you learn and apply it in future, not only getting results whilst you're working with us, but long-term too. So if you are interested in some really personal online coaching, then definitely check out our coaching, which is always linked in the description. But without further ado, let's get into the chat with Kassem. Kassem, I thought you'd be the best person to ask this question. What would be the wrong way to interpret the recent study looking at full ROM versus lengthened partials, and why? And actually, just for the listeners, if they haven't listened to the podcast with Milo and Dr. Pack, Dr. Milo and Dr. Pack, they should check that one out first as kind of pre-listening, because I think that'd be really useful. But I'd love to ask you this question as a kind of subsequent to that.
Well, I have probably somewhat of a controversial opinion, or at least I'll say an opinion I haven't heard echo anywhere else, which is I almost don't look at the study as directly comparing the full ROM to the lengthened partials because of the number of confounders and limitations there are. So it's almost hard for me to take this study and put it, in the bag of either for or against lengthened partials, because I'm just not confident that the results that we're seeing, null or otherwise, were actually because of the range of motion differences, because there were so many other limitations in the study design. And I think, as you said, like a lot of people are they're running with the title, assuming that's the story, and then kind of throwing their bias on whichever side it is, whether it's like, oh, this disproves lengthened partials, or this proves lengthened partials are just as good, or however you want to push your bias.
Yeah, it's interesting because of the studies we have, which I think we can say now there's 4 directly looking at lengthened partials versus full range of motion. Like everything's been in favor of lengthened partials or neutral. And that's still the case here. But even I think from reading between the lines and obviously having seen some of your content, which I would advise people as well, probably go and check Kassem, and you should be following Kassem over on Instagram because he highlights great things like this. But when you see that, some people would look at this as neutral, like, oh, you could do one or the other. But in fact, that might even not be the right interpretation either, because of, like you said, these confounders.
Mm-hmm. If you want, I can kind of summarize the content, but kind of the way I've framed this is, if you asked me to design a study where I wouldn't expect the range of motion to show up, like I wouldn't expect there to be a difference if there was one, right? Well, first, this study, the big difference between this and all the prior research is that this was done in well-trained lifters. So you already have a harder population to show a difference, just because they're not going to gain as much muscle as beginners or untrained people, and therefore it just becomes harder to see a difference when you're looking at a smaller difference overall, right? Now, that's not a limitation of the study. That's what the study was for. But knowing that, that means you kind of have to, dot your I's and cross your T's on everything else, so you can be sure that you can see a difference if there is one, and be sure that difference is caused by the intervention that you're trying to test. So the fact that this study was only 8 weeks kind of compounds how difficult it would have been to see a difference, because you're looking at a more difficult population, and then also the smaller time window we have, the less likely you're going to see a difference. So already, like, those two limitations there mean that the study would have to be done extremely well at isolating that variable and, measured very, very well to be able to get any statistical significant difference, if there was one. Okay. Then we look at kind of the design of the study. The exercise basically that they chose were not ones that had been previously shown to have a difference between range of motion in prior studies. And I think that, you need a certain amount of internal validity before you can move to ecological validity. And so if the goal here was to answer the question of, would we expect to see similar or a degree of benefits for lengthened partials in a well-trained population relative to, say, our newbie or beginner population, then I think we should change as few variables as possible other than that one we're trying to investigate. So I think even at least including an exercise or muscle group that there was evidence of the past eliminates the factor of, like, well, these just could be exercises that lengthened partials don't have a difference and prior research did. Do we know it was a population thing now or not, or do we know it was just different exercises? So we're introducing another confounder. Additionally, the exercise selection that was used, I would say, is largely principally different than what we have seen in the comparison data to favor lengthened partials. Like, if we're talking about, like, okay, knee extensions, things like that, where it's an arcing motion, it's a relatively consistent resistance challenge, that's going to be different than, say, something like a Bayesian curl or a chest press or a row. Like, there hasn't been any presses or pulls. And kind of one of the theories I have is that exercises where there is kind of like that dead spot at the top tend not to allow you to have an increased performance or get more volume load in the lengthened position when you use partials. And the one prior example of that in the research was a leg press, and that was one of the studies that showed no difference. It's not a very good study, especially investigating hypertrophy, because, I think they only used the concentric, and it was a very, very small partial. So there's a ton of limitations in that, but that type of an exercise is the one kind of in the pre-existing research where, there was no difference between a full range and a lengthened partial there. So you have several of these exercises that kind of fit that category. They're different. And then we're including exercises that I would say are, we'll say, more challenging to standardize from a setup and a technique standpoint, right? So the Bayesian curl, for example, most of your audience is probably familiar with the Bayesian curl is. You're setting up with the arm in a degree of extension, and the idea is that you're going to have tension in that lengthened position with the cable angle. But I think one of the amazing things that these guys did do was they provided video, both of what their instruction was, like a demonstration video that they made for the researchers and participants, but then they also provided a certain amount of video of the participants themselves. However, in examining that video, you can see that there isn't a consistent setup for the Bayesian curl, where basically some people had challenge in the lengthened position and other people did not, because the cable was either set up parallel to the arm or off parallel. And sometimes that differed between arms, which means that either their partial or their full ROM was getting trained with a different resistance challenge, which we have pretty good evidence that that's part of the equation here as well. And that can really muddy the results there. And obviously I think basically we had like one video per arm per exercise for not every participant, but I would say for roughly over half the participants for most exercises. So we don't have a complete picture of like every rep of every set of the whole study. We just have like a small representative sample. But within that, there's enough variation that like, well, okay, well, how much variation was there from set to set, from session to session, et cetera, right? So the Bayesian curl is, it's not a bad exercise in terms of training, but it is a more complicated exercise in terms of setting up and standardizing. And then the technique that they used for that exercise, I basically broke it up into 4 pieces or 4 types. Like, and one of those was an extreme, almost like if you had your arm behind your back and you tried to do a row of like pulling your elbow up, I wouldn't even call it like a curl anymore at that point in time. And there was, I think, around a third or just under a third of the participants were using that type of a technique for either the partial or for both, right? Sometimes the technique varied between arms. So that's 25% of your volume, arguably a little bit more if we're talking about like how much direct versus kind of indirect volume we're looking at. But if we have basically a huge chunk of the volume that's completely unstandardized for the setup or the resistance challenge and the technique, and then also the last thing in terms of the exercises, like the range of motion, if we look at the actual final positions in those examples, was not near as big of a difference as most of the prior research, right? So if we were measuring true full ROM versus a 50% range of motion partial, what we'd expect then is that there's a 50% difference in the average muscle length of those groups, okay? In this study, just estimating based off of the footage that was available, we're looking at half of that, right? Closer to just under a 25% difference in average muscle length between groups. So when you start adding up that it's a tough population to measure, we have a short amount of time, we're now introducing exercises that we don't have as much confidence in what we should expect. We're not quite standardizing the range of motion there very well. It's a smaller range of motion. We're not standardizing the resistance challenge. We're not standardizing the technique on some of the stuff. Essentially, like I'm looking at it as like, well, how do I know if there was an effect? What would be the cause? Like the confidence just kind of keeps dropping as we add on those variables. And even if you look at the dumbbell curl, so they did a supinating dumbbell curl. Some people stood against a wall. Some people stood just in the middle of a room or whatever. But I just feel like this is another example where, okay, the technique on the dumbbell curl was not near as varied as the Bayesian curl, but they did use a supinating dumbbell, and they kind of varied whether the person set up against the wall, but they didn't use the wall. Like they didn't use it to brace the arm or to standardize the position. And in some cases, basically the dumbbell would limit the range of motion or not, depending on how thick the person was and, kind of how much they let their shoulder move, et cetera, and stuff like that. So it's like, why didn't we just why didn't we do a supinated curl instead of a supinating curl just to reduce that one, like, okay, are we going to hit the wall or not? It's just an extra motion, and none of that adds to answering the research question, but it did add variation into the technique. Now that one itself is small, but it's just like you take these small little limitations and you do one after another, after another, after another, and, not trying to like take away from the work and the effort that was put into doing this. I just think that, like, in my opinion, they completely failed at designing a study to answer the question that we wanted the answer to, which is, do lengthened partials work in well-trained individuals? Because that has been kind of one of the, we'll say, the really deep unanswered questions on this topic, because we have all of this research, but a glaring limitation of that research is it's pretty much mostly in beginners or untrained subjects.
Really well rounded there. I think some amazing points. Something I highlighted in the podcast with the guys was, it was like, is 8 weeks. Whenever you see a study that, obviously it's hard to get people more than 12 weeks, but when I see that length of study in well-trained lifters, it's like, mean, you're gonna have to do some extreme things to try and see something here, because if it's and like the guy said, it's like an ecologically valid training that they think would be productive. Like if everyone's doing that full ROM or not, that like you kind of hinted at, the lengthened exposures might be very similar because of the fact of the exercise selection being maybe more lengthened biased. They're also pausing in the lengthened range for full ROM and also the lengthened partials. So I totally get where you're coming from in terms of, and this was the title of your post on Instagram, was like it was doomed to fail from the get-go. And I think you highlighting these kind of quote unquote, confounders, I think the guys would hear what you're saying and be like, you know what, like everything you're saying makes sense. Again, it doesn't dismiss the hard work that they've put in. You can still look at this and be like, well, under those conditions, there was no difference really. So that's cool. But what if we changed this, and then maybe we would see some. So at least from my understanding, something you'd like to see, and I think we'd all like to see, is like, hey, the calves have been extensively studied. Let's get some people who are kind of been training their calves like hell for the last years and put those into one of those trials where they're just exclusively lengthened partials or full ROM, do it for an extended period of time. And then you can see that isolated example, and kind of maybe that can give us a bit more insight there. I don't know if that's a fair assumption to make, that you'd like to see that.
Yeah, to answer that question of how this would work in well-trained subjects, I think the best bet you have is, hey, let's take at least some or very similar to the designs that we have shown work in untrained subjects, and just change that one variable of how trained is the subject, and see if we get similar results, half the results, no difference. Then we are confident that we answer that question. I think we need a certain amount of internal validity in order to even design a study for ecological validity, if you will, right? Like I feel like sometimes the ecological validity thing kind of just gets thrown around as a scapegoat when, like, okay, a study didn't have the controls that we wanted or whatnot. Because I think when it comes to ecological validity, it's not just like, hey, this is something random people would do. It needs to be specific to the population that would actually be implementing this. So if you're doing a study and it's on an advanced nuanced training technique or program variable, the population that you're simulating is not your recreational gym goer. Because like everybody watching this podcast, right, is probably tiers above the average person that just goes into the gym. They sit on some machines or whatever and they do their thing, right? These people are more focused on technique. They're more focused on the range of motion, and they're tracking things and RIR and whatever. Like, that population is different than the average person. So we can tighten up our expectations for what's ecologically valid for these more advanced training principles that we're investigating, because the people that actually would be applying them would be investing in being competent in that application. So we don't have to just be like, well, people add, a lot of weird form and not standardized or whatever, but that's what you'd see in the real world. And I'm like, well, I guess if your standard for the people applying this is very, very low, you could say, yes, that is. But I think that the standard should be, at least at the beginning, for sure, shooting at people that would be successfully applying these techniques. So if we're going to include a Bayesian curl in the study, it should be like everybody is doing what we would all agree is a Bayesian curl, right? Not some people are doing what looks like a Bayesian curl. Some people are doing, a shoulder extension technique. Some people are doing a shoulder flexion technique. Some people do have a lengthened challenge. Some people don't have a lengthened challenge. To me, it's like, no, actually what we have is just people doing a random assortment of exercises, and techniques at this point in time. We're just saying, hey, I wonder if there'll still be a change if there's a really small difference in average muscle length between the two. And to me, that's just asking way too much of a study design, especially with this population and this time window.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It makes me think of Martin Refalo did a really ecologically valid assessment of 2 and 1 RAR versus failure, but that was in trained lifters, and they also had a period of time beforehand, like testing that these individuals knew how to approximate RARs and failure. So they had that kind of induction. I'm not aware of that happening in this one, where it could have been, I guess, useful if the guys had been I don't know, under Pack and Milo for a session and being like, this is how we want you to do everything, that probably would have helped standardize that. Whereas, yeah, you give people exercise videos and they go off on their own and they're going to have their own interpretation, and I don't know, maybe they're not filming themselves and assessing that and making sure that it's how it's meant to be done. But it's just like you say, like, if you can't manage what you aren't measuring and keeping consistent, and if it's too varied, you can't draw too many conclusions from it.
Yeah. I think for the people that do see this video, you're gonna have a lot of people that were questionable of study results, because they'd always be like, I wonder what that form looked like, or I wonder what that technique looked like. And I think for those people, they're going to see this and be like, oh, yep, exactly. I'm just going to dismiss all of the research, at this point in time, because who knows? I do think it did a good job of showing that these people trained hard, right? And you could see that they had, some well-trained subjects that had, accrued a decent amount of muscle mass. Not that that's the only indicator of being well-trained, but I think visually, you can't see somebody's training history looking at them other than either noticing that they're big or strong, right? So I think having that video evidence that, yes, this kind of is representative of the population that you're working for. These people are putting in the effort. You could argue in some cases and I think Pac mentioned this on your previous podcast, is like for some of the full ROM stuff, participants were going into basically a partial or two at the end, which again, that kind of closes the gap of how different the two groups are. But just to make sure that they were actually training. So, for sure, they ticked a couple of those boxes, but I think a lot of people are going to be kind of left questioning more like what the technique is from research, or that's going on in the research. I think, and I was having a private conversation with another person that's deep into the research world. And, because I wanted to kind of like talk to some people about like how representative of this is what's going on in your lab, et cetera. Like, is what I'm looking at here kind of an exception or the rule or somewhere in between? And, basically, like I was joking, it's like, okay, I'm just going to stop trusting any research that isn't done on like leg extensions, leg curls, or just machines where it's almost impossible to screw up. And to be honest, I think when we are doing internal validity, that's probably a good practice to just like eliminate as many of those variables as possible. And then we can move on to the more challenging stuff. So I'm just like, part of me is just very puzzled with why they went the direction they went, with the goal of, I think, maybe a little, like, my opinion is like maybe it's a little bit hubris to try and investigate something on ecological validity before we're really certain on the internal validity. Like, you have to be very, very confident to be like, okay, cool, we're going to make the study that much more challenging. And also then just like knowing kind of what level you have in terms of the people that are actually going to be participating, but also the researchers that are going to be assisting in this, to actually be able to instruct that. Because the study was advertised as, hey, these people were under instruction. Like, all of the videos were done by Milo. So he literally was there. You can see Pac there in the videos or whatnot. So I don't think that we can say that the technique outcomes were because the researchers were not present there. Because my understanding is that they got a lot of instruction and supervision. I think it's just the instruction and supervision they got led to the outcomes that we saw.
Yeah, I guess when I think about what we can take from this, it's the case that, where is it? I had a note of what it was. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there it is. So in a relatively standard looking upper body program, and this is actually something Jeff said on a post of yours, I think we did show that in a relatively standard looking relatively standard looking upper body program, it probably doesn't matter much if you use full ROM or Lengthened partials. Like, that's kind of what his takeaway was. But I think that isn't as satisfactory as trying to find more than that. But I guess it did show that trained lifters can grow from lengthened partials. So if anyone was doubting if they could grow at all, it did definitely show that convincingly well.
Yeah. I mean, I still would even be slightly cautious in that statement, because it's like, well, just remember that the range of motion was only one of many confounding variables. So can we really even, all we can say is that the range of motion difference that they did do didn't have an overwhelming effect in either direction, that it was able to overshadow all of the other limitations and confounders, right? That's really all we can say is that, hey, whatever impact range of motion had in this study was not significant in relative to the impact of all of the other variables. But if you removed all of those, then maybe we're looking at a completely different story. So I don't even think you can walk it back that little. I think you have to take a big step back and be like, yeah, I just really don't know what, if any, impact range of motion had on this. It was just insignificant in the face of all of the other limitations, because we're talking a small difference in range of motion and varying resistance challenge and stuff like that, and I mean, I don't want to get too much into the nuances if you don't want me to, but I didn't even talk about the tricep stuff, because the triceps actually varied the range of motion more, but they chose to use a press that essentially really utilizes the tricep in the short position. And we see very little activity in the triceps on straight for CMG, and that kind of matches mechanical modeling as well, so that the triceps aren't really positioned to move a load in the length of position. So in the bottom of press, basically your elbows almost hold close to an isometric in the bottom few degrees of a press. And that's because elbow extension is kind of a wasted force at the bottom, because you kind of like just pushing out, and it's not really helping you to lift up until you kind of reach that point where your elbow is kind of, we'll say, like parallel or slightly in front of the shoulder joint. Then all of a sudden that elbow extension starts really gaining leverage to be able to help you press forward. Whenever you have a handle that's fixed, whether that's a barbell, like you can push out on the barbell to use more triceps. Same thing with a fixed handle press, but this wasn't just a fixed handle. Anybody that's ever used a hammer strength machine or a similar knockoff or type variation knows that the actual, like the weight, the external moment of that weight gets longer as you go through the concentric and get into the short position. So it's kind of like pressing with chains or bands. It's just getting harder in the short. So not only is the full ROM group kind of working in a range of motion where it's much more specific for the triceps to do the top half of the press and the bottom half of the press, but then you're also working with a resistance challenge that's like favored towards the part of the range of motion that the full ROM group is getting. And so when I look at that, I'm like, it's almost like the full ROM group did twice as much tricep volume as the partial ROM group because of the exercise selection. Because when we look at partials, not every exercise done as a partial is going to be like an effective partial for every muscle group, just because that muscle is involved at some point in time, right? Like when we start looking at compound lifts where we have two joints moving, there can be one part of the lift where one joint really doesn't move, and that the tissues that would be doing that action don't do much in half the lift, but they do a ton in the other half of the lift. Like having a tricep exercise where basically all of the recruitment for the tricep is going to be in the short position, and then doing a lengthened partial is kind of like doing the one group does twice. It's doing 8 sets instead of 4 sets per session on the triceps. And there's the biggest difference in the results was for the triceps in favor of full range of motion. And I think it's got to be probably the case to me. Is like, well, this group was just doing more. Now, were they technically doing a lengthened partial in the press versus a full range of motion partial? Yes. But is the context of that very different than comparing should you do full range of motion or lengthened partials on your elbow extension exercises? To me, it's like, man, those are like totally different contexts right there. And so I think kind of trying to combine those exercises in there really kind of limit that. Now, what I would have loved of is if they would have measured the pecs and the lats, and we would actually saw if the presses and pulls made a difference there, because we don't have anything on those. So I was like, the only reason I think that you would add in these other exercises that complicate things was, are we also going to get data on those muscles? And, now I know that measuring the pecs and the lats is significantly more challenging than measuring biceps and triceps. And so, that's just as a research challenge. Yeah. Like everybody I know that looks at muscle thickness measures, like measuring lats is just an absolute nightmare. So I understand that, but at some point in time, we're going to have to cross that bridge. Right?
Yeah. I think that's a great addition because it makes me think of, I literally trained my chest today, and triceps for me are a dominant muscle and I want more chest. So I do soft lockouts or lengthened partials basically on my pressing. And so when you were describing that, I was like, yeah, I bet if they were, my thought would be if they were to test the chest would have grown more because it's getting more lengthened exposures, but for the sake of maybe some of the tricep volume that they're getting. But you could build a program to obviously get around that kind of issue too, if you wanted to then isolate the tricep later in your workout, which is something you're very well known for, right? You're known for trying to bias certain muscle groups, get them kind of maximal growth, and then find something else to do it. And I mean, that's bodybuilding kind of 101 in many ways, like try and get each muscle group maximized in that sense. So yeah, I think, and the same for back, of course. I think that would have been very interesting because that's where a lot of us have theorized would be one of the muscle groups that would benefit the most, is where it's not getting that challenge at length. And so if you're to miss out the short and do more weight and more reps and get more lengthened exposures, you should theoretically be able to see a big difference there.
Yeah. To be honest, like, using partials and presses is a programming design strategy we use to limit the triceps when we want to maybe have an arm day that's closer to our push-pull day, and we're trying to actually minimize the tricep fatigue. So like the strategies that you can take if you want to press with less triceps is like, okay, don't use a fixed handle and then you can't press out against it. And you can emphasize the length and range of motion, and the obvious one is you can incorporate flies, but with flies, then we actually are adding in some biceps. So if you're just trying to take both the elbow flexors and extensors out, you can implement strategies to reduce those in these push and pull movements, right? And I think if you were investigating for the biceps and triceps, you would, if you were going to include press or pull variations, you wouldn't want the volume of those presses to be substantial in a way that it would kind of cloud that. And here, 50% of the volume was push and pulls. And the way the triceps were set is like, okay, this, like, if they would have done a close grip, kind of tricep bias press to have a compound motion in there, but it was still biased towards elbow extension through the full range of motion, then you did a partial and a full, I think then we're looking at, cool, now we're kind of seeing kind of similar context, at least both of these exercises, the triceps are going to be involved in the full range of motion rather than having one exercise where basically it's like, well, this is almost like no recruitment of the triceps versus a ton, right? And I threw up an example using EMG. EMG isn't everything, but I think a lot of people just like want to throw it out. But I'm just going to be honest, if we go from like having like very little activity to a ton of activity, you can assume that there's going to be a mechanical tension difference, right? Now, when we're comparing things and it's like, well, this one was like 120% and this one was 105, like we get into like, well, okay, we can't use this as a predictive hypertrophy model, but there are cases where it's pretty clear that like, okay, well, something is it's either significantly involved or not significantly involved, right? What we can't do with EMG very well is compare multiple things that are significantly involved, especially when the range of motion, and things differ, and the exercises have a lot of different. Then basically the ability to predict things with EMG starts to, fall off. But I think in this example, it's like, okay, it's very easy to see that we're using much less triceps. And like I said, that's reflected in the mechanical modeling. And like you said, you've done it yourself, and you can do this as, like you could test it yourself by saying, hey, if I do a partial press and then I go knock out tricep extensions with one arm, and then I do full range, then go knock out triceps extensions with the other arm, what you'll find is that one of those is going to fatigue the triceps a lot more. And I don't think it's a question of which one I think it is.
Yeah. Really well said. And I think that actually touches on another limitation of if people just read the abstract or the title, they're assuming all muscle groups were measured in this case, but it's like it was just the arms in this case. Like it wasn't looking at the chest, the back. Like you can't suddenly say, oh, they're just equivocal for all muscle groups. Because again, we've kind of highlighted that we think certain muscles might benefit more because of the exercise selection that's available to them to be able to benefit from the lengthened partials. So I think that's another really big caveat to throw out there. I don't know if there's anything more you want to touch on this study in particular, Kassem. Otherwise, we can talk about another post you did, which I thought was really good in terms of research comparing exercises, providing an either or comparison and how people should view that in the context of an entire program. Because that's kind of the other question, right? It's like, hey, those studies also can't be misinterpreted either. And you have to kind of think a little bit outside the box.
So not in terms of the study, but maybe just in terms of like to wrap up the topic, because in my opinion, we're still left in flux of like, we don't know what lengthened partials are going to do for a trained population. I don't think this study moved us forward in answering that question, like at all. That's my honest opinion. People can disagree with that. I've had multiple conversations with several of the authors. Some people very open-minded to this, some people not, and some people just, ignore it altogether. But I think, if you want to know what my opinion is on how do you go about this right now, is the same as kind of what we had in our last conversation, is exercises where lengthened partials seem to make a big difference in the volume load, right? Like if you can do more reps with the same load as lengthened partials as you can, we're at least moving the volume needle on there, right? So exercises where it's the same or less, I think, if it's the same, it's probably, just go by preference, right? It's like, if it's less, I don't think there's any magical way that lengthened partials could work if they actually result in you getting less volume in the lengthened position by reducing the volume load that you can get. That's just, I think you're off the rails if you think that doing a variation of lengthened partials where it reduces your performance is going to produce more hypertrophy, right? Because then you're just dismissing everything that we think about, volume. So I think the best thing to do is understand that, like, hey, if I can use a technique, lengthened partials or otherwise, that simply allows me to accumulate more training volume, more, time under tension in that lengthened position per set, more volume load per set in that position, then that's probably a safe bet of like, that's an exercise where this could be applicable, right? And the easiest way to do that is just to see how many partials you could, can you continue doing partials at the end? If so, then there's a chance that if you did only partials that you would also be able to do even more, right? And if you want to just be in the middle ground, then do just the partials at the end strategy as kind of like a halfway, between the two, or do some sets full ROM and some sets as partials. Like there's gray areas that exist in here. But if you're trying to apply this stuff, I think principally what we have now, you can kind of use like the difference in volume load as your kind of exercise by exercise guide for best practices, right? Whether you're a beginner or advanced, right? Because at least we know that we're moving volume, right? Which I'd say a little bit more confident in. Volume seems to still be a factor for advanced trainers, right? Lengthened partials, we don't know yet.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. Additionally, you get access to our exclusive Revive Stronger member site, where you'll be able to watch over hundreds of hours worth of educational content. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of the way I view it as well. It's interesting. It immediately makes me think of the research on rest times and how longer rest times were promoting more growth. And then the recent meta-analysis came out and it's kind of like you might be able to make up for that lack of growth through like doing more sets there. It's kind of similar here. If you did lengthened partials on a leg press, you get less total volume load, but maybe you can do another set of it. And it's that muddies the water, of course. So we're comparing a set by set basis. But I think, like you said, you can kind of pick your challenge in regards to, hey, do I finish in a set with some lengthened partials, or do I do exclusively lengthened partial sets and exclusively full ROM sets? I think just kind of doing all full ROM and disregarding the potential benefits of lengthened partials in some of those exercises where you can get more reps at the same load, I think is probably not the best route to go down, but clearly is people are growing from it. But if we're looking for optimal, which is what people listening to this podcast are, I think that's a great takeaway.
I think most people are always trying to step in the direction of efficiency. So it's like anytime we can get more in either similar time or similar number of sets, right? That's kind of the direction that most people are going. Yes, we have plenty of instances where, hey, you could just make up for this with volume, but I just don't think that's practical for most people. Most people don't have an unlimited, time, patience, effort in the gym. And so people are constantly looking for ways to either get more out of the same or the same out of less or more out of less, if you can, and I think that's where it's like when you're applying this stuff, it's like that's what you're looking at. It's like, okay, where could I apply this so that I don't have to actually spend a significant more amount of time or effort, but I can still be moving in that direction of maximizing my progress?
Yeah, really well said. One further question actually I have, something that I got highlighted to me quite a few times, was there seems to be, I haven't seen any good data on this personally, but some people are promoting the idea that lengthened partials lead to more muscle damage, and more muscle damage isn't necessarily a good thing. Have you seen this kind of idea being promoted? Have you seen any data suggesting that that's a thing and something we should be concerned about?
So there are things, we have research using isometrics showing greater fatigue at a long length versus a short length. If we look at things from a physiological standpoint, mechanistic standpoint, it seems to make sense that basically whether you're looking at the calcium ion mechanisms or even the fascia or nuclear compression mechanisms of fatigue and DOMS, like those things would all be accentuated in the lengthened position, right? And not so much in the short position. Now, I think this is kind of blown out of proportion because most of the time we're looking at, all right, we're taking people that aren't adapted to these training adaptations and then applying this. And I think in practice, everybody has kind of noticed that, hey, when I first start working at a longer range of motion, I'm initially a little bit more sore, maybe I fatigue a little bit faster or feel like I can't, it's taking more days to recover. But we also adapt to the stresses of that position. Just like, if we work exclusively in the short position, it's more metabolically demanding. Well, guess what? We get more metabolically efficient. We have mitochondrial adaptations and stuff to that type of stress. Same thing should happen in the lengthened position, in that we should actually get better. And that's probably one of the mechanisms of why, you don't keep getting the same amount of soreness doing these lengthened exposures. And if you change exercises that are somewhat different from a motor pattern, but not too different in terms of length, you don't experience the same kind of change in soreness as you do going from an exercise that was a relatively short bias to a lengthened bias challenge. So I think what's overlooked is a big chunk of that increased fatigue is going to be when you first start. which is another reason that like maybe if these ranges of motion are novel, we should be cautious about short length studies, right? Because then basically maybe a higher percentage of the weeks in training are when this is kind of a novel stimulus where that fatigue could be a factor, kind of holding back, subsequent performance and stuff like that. But as we accrue that repeated bout effect, right, we start adapting to that. Well, I think then we're going to get less damage, less inflammation, better recovery, right? So, I mean, when it comes to the neural fatigue, I still think we have kind of more questions than answers on that. There's a lot of data, but it's kind of hard to parse through and to kind of use the ecologically valid thing. A lot of it is looking at either single things or again, it's, early phase. Like it's not, hey, how does this change as somebody's, 12 weeks into a program? It's what does this look like 1, 2, or 3 weeks, into things. And, a lot changes from an adaptation standpoint in the first 3 weeks of utilizing an exercise, like to the point where a lot of fatigue mechanisms likely fall below the threshold of having any sort of limitation after that 3-week window. So while it's you can't say that some of the mechanisms described here are wrong, what we have to do is understand that these mechanisms are not in place or at that magnitude all the time where they would be significant. So fatigue is only relevant if it reaches a significance that actually impacts your ability to perform, recover, et cetera. And I think there's a lot of fear-mongering type discussions around things in the fitness industry, fatigue being one of them. And then you get people like that are, they're either scared to train a certain way or a certain, hard or volume or whatever, because they feel like, man, all of this fatigue is just going to keep me from doing this stuff. But we have some of these studies, like the 52 set quad study, right? Those people still gain muscle just doing what I would think is an insane amount of training volume, right? And the fact that it included things like squats, right? Like, if we were talking like, oh, you're the neural fatigue is going to hit you, the volume and all this other stuff, it's like those people would have just like trained themselves into a grave. But instead, they actually continued to be able to progressively overload over time. And actually talked to Dr. D'Souza on this. And he said that, like, yeah, after a certain period, like the participants were getting really well adapted to the pace of the training and the volume. Right. And so I think, the unsung hero is the repeated bout effect here, like is going to allow you to overcome a lot of things that are fatigue limitations early. And the fear mongering that you need to avoid fatigue is to me kind of farce. If you look at this through the lens of performance, right? Like say we're training an athlete that needs to run fast or run for a long period of time or some sort of performance outcome. Oftentimes they're directly attacking the limitations to that, right? And so when we're exposing ourselves to something where it's like, okay, there's now a greater mechanism for fatigue, right? Like by leaning into that and doing that, guess what? Our body adapts to getting better at that. And part of the way that we periodize an N1 is to actually kind of continually kind of push into these like fatiguing aspects of training, whether that be, higher training density, whether it may be focusing a little bit more on lengthened bias stuff, whether it be more focusing on metabolic demands, but basically kind of like continuing to kind of like knock down these things that could be potential limiters, right? So then like when you're in your like safe little window of hypertrophy stuff, that like you're not running into these things. And so roundabout, probably longer answer that you wanted, fatigue is an issue, but it's an issue that I think for the most part goes away over time, right? With the caveat that you have a lifestyle that permits you to recover. I think the real issue with fatigue usually comes outside of the gym, right? Because you're not going to be able to adapt to missing hours of sleep and not getting in your protein goal and your calories like you are from training. We'll look at it. Training is a stress that creates a positive adaptation, But outside the gym, we have a lot of stresses that don't have that positive adaptation response. When we accumulate those, I think that's when we actually really suffer from the negative impacts of fatigue, is when we're accumulating an abundance of stresses where there's no positive outcome to those stresses. Right.
Yeah, I think that was really well described, and it makes me think of the saying, the dose makes the poison. And when you look at anything that causes fatigue in the gym, especially specific to hypertrophy, it's because it's generating a ton of stimulus as well. I think that's where I have a problem sometimes with people's interpretation of stimulus to fatigue ratio. They're looking to get like all stimulus for no fatigue. And it's like, well, the ways we generate a lot of stimulus, like training close to failure, training at longer muscle lengths, training at full ROM, what have you, that all generates more stimulus, but also more fatigue than like doing short partial ranges of motion in the short, or staying really far away from failure, or doing more volume versus less, of course. So I think, yeah, your point of you need to manage that is the key take home. And don't be, I like the idea of people being resilient. And yeah, unfortunately, people get kind of scared and worried about doing some of these hard things. It's like, you'll be surprised how well the body can adapt, like you said with Dr. D'Souza, with how much volume they were able to like push themselves through and any kind of, I think if you speak to any kind of very hardworking athletes, or if anyone's listening who's been, I don't know, a high level athlete at school or what have you, like they probably push themselves through some things that were more challenging than they ever expected to be able to do. Or you talk to a bodybuilder going to kind of contest lean levels, like, yeah, to a lot of people outside in, that's not manageable. But when you go through it, hey, it's actually surprisingly manageable, though very challenging. The body can deal with these things. But like you said, I think that discussion of outside the gym is hugely important. People discount that all the time. Like, oh, I couldn't recover from that. It's like, well, yeah, but are you well set up outside the gym to be able to manage all of that? Probably not. A lot of athletes they're either training or they're resting. Unfortunately, we're not blessed to be able to do that most of the time.
In my experience, when it comes to the bodybuilding population, the people that do seem to run into fatigue limitations, it's either stuff outside the gym, or it's the people that are trying to progress things at a rate that's unreasonable to expect them to adapt to, right? Like, especially when it comes into prep, like if you're starting to pull calories, right? Well, that's a huge recovery resource right there. And so I think people that are either they're trying to make jumps in volume too much, or maybe they're changing their program like too often, and when I say changing their program too often, I mean not just like simply doing different exercises or whatever, but like they're changing what the fundamental most stressful aspect of the training is, too often. I think that's where basically people run into it, because they're not actually allowing for them to take advantage of the adaptations, because they're trying to run it. They're basically trying to keep pace in front of their body to adapt by either going too fast, or they're changing so often that their body can never like really, gather and make use of the adaptations of one, physiological system. And then already now it's like, hey, we're going to go and challenge something different, right? I think you have to find a sweet spot in how much you can progress, and how much and how often you can vary things, so that you're not getting stagnant, but also you're not, trying to jump ahead of what your body's capable of.
Yeah, it makes me think of finding that right surplus, like just above maintenance. If you can't force feed muscle growth, if you do that, you're going to accumulate fat way quicker, which could be fatigue in this scenario, and you're going to have to pull back. It's similar here. If people, I can do more, they add way more to the bar or double their set volume, yeah, you're going to be hit by a wall of fatigue. Whereas if you could elongate that, do it at a more appropriate pace, like you said, this sweet spot, and just coast, or not coast, but like continue to chip away at that, going to be a much more productive time. So yeah, excellently said. Do we want to talk about the research comparing exercises providing an either or, and what could be the kind of things people need to be aware of when interpreting that?
Yeah. In general, I think people have an expectation of how we can program and the choices that we can make based off of research that is well beyond where we are at with the research. And people want to know, like, okay, if I love the questions are like, hey, if you could only do one, right? Because it's like automatically I'm like, well, why are we answering this question? Because the reality is that in most cases that's not the case. You don't have to choose between one leg curl. And if you have to choose between one leg curl, well, then the question is already answered for you. You're going to do the leg curl that you have, right? It's that simple. Does it matter? No, you just do the one that you have, right? If you think there's limitations to it for your goal, then look at how you could modify that. But essentially, a lot of what we have, whether it's looking at range of motion, et cetera, is that when it comes to exercise, we investigate one exercise at a time, right? Or we investigate, certain exercises, but you have to be cautious looking at the investigation of one exercise and how that would apply to other exercises that weren't investigated, right? We can make guesses based off of how similar exercises are in terms of biomechanics, activation, range of motion, resistance challenge, et cetera. And that should inform your best practices. But we also don't know the effect of combining exercises. And the research example that I'll keep using, because I'm desperately waiting for another example, is the leg extension study they did, where they compared full range of motion, lengthened partials, short partials, and then a group that split its volume between lengthened partials and short partials. And the lengthened partial group had the best hypertrophy, but probably statistically insignificant difference, especially at like a couple of the sites, but just mainly like the most distal site still favored the lengthened partial group. But very, very close was the group that combined the lengthened partial and the short partial. They did split their volume half and half. That both of those groups outperformed the full range of motion group, and the group that had the split volume had the best strength outcome for the whole range of motion as well, right? So that's not even doing two different exercises. That's just simply training both ranges of motion. And we clearly need a lot more data here. But we also have a variety of studies that look at training with we'll say they have a limited number of exercises and then basically a greater number of exercises. So higher variation. And the higher varied group tends to lean in favor of more overall hypertrophy, although in a lot of these are in athletes and trained subjects or whatever, so the differences are small. But for the investigations that did look at either multiple regions or used MRI, also showed that the group that trained and varied grew in more regions of the muscle. So let's just take the study that we're just talking about, right? They measured the elbow flexors at 2 points, right? It was 45 and 55%. So they didn't even measure the most distal site, which that's another limitation if we're trying to investigate lengthened partials, right? But like, how much detail do we really know about the hypertrophy occurred when we're just looking at two parts of the muscle? And especially when it comes to more complex muscles. Now, you can look at the biceps and be like, well, biceps are a pretty simple muscle. They're a fusiform muscle. They're kind of like the slug-shaped thing or whatever. So if it gets bigger, the middle-ish should get bigger. And if we actually look at nuanced anatomy, we see that like there's actually a lot more kind of, we'll say, we don't have an exoskeleton like ants do, which makes them really strong. But we also are not just like tendon, and muscles pull between these two really pure defined points. They have kind of connections with other tissues, the fascial tissue, and broader origins and insertions, and sometimes multiples of those that people don't consider. So people think the biceps is like, oh, the bicep, it just attaches at the shoulder down here. Well, it actually attaches at multiple places on the shoulder. There are slips of it that tie into the intramuscular septums, which is the deep fascia on each side of the arm. We found research showing slips going into the deltoids and the pecs, right? And at the elbow, we have part of it that attaches to the aponeurosis, which is this like fascia that runs around and attaches to the other side of the arm. So the bicep actually attaches to both forearm bones, and most people don't realize that. And what that means is that with all of these different context points, is that under different conditions and at different ranges of motion, it's going to kind of mechanically change the stress that muscle is going under within itself regionally. So when it comes to choosing a single best exercise, the answer is almost always going to be like, well, the single best exercise is not to use a single exercise, likely in most cases. And arguably, it might even be that the single best range of motion is not to use a single range of motion, right? It would have been really cool if we had a new piece of data to discuss that with based off of this. I just don't think we do. But I think that knowing that there seems to be a favor of variation is what gives me hesitation of just throwing out the short position, right? But at the very least, let's say that you're in, well, I'll go ahead and use the words, the strength cult, or the stretch cult, right? Even if you're a diehard, you're the person that wants the stretch cult shirt, right? You don't even use full range of motion when you take a shower. Like you keep your elbows at 90 degrees when you wash your hair, whatever it is. Even if that's you probably should be doing a variety of those lengthened exercises to actually get full development and maximize your hypertrophy potential. We want to bring this back to fatigue, right? So when we're looking at fatigue, if we're looking at a muscle, if we fatigue in a certain region of a muscle, that might limit our ability to continue to get stimulus in another region of the muscle in that same exercise. So you'll hear the topic of neuromechanical matching a lot on social media, and I'll just tell everybody, like, the way it's discussed, it's not accurate. But I believe in the principle, but I think that also stems all the way to the regional aspect, right? Otherwise, like, why would we see distal biased hypertrophy if there wasn't actually some neurological and mechanical reasoning as to why these fibers are experiencing more tension or more stimulus in these exercises relative to others, right? We wouldn't see these regional differences. We would see basically uniform growth across muscles or proportional growth across muscles, whether the resistance challenge varied or the angle or et cetera. But that's not what we see. What we see is these very varied responses within the muscle themselves. And like, one of the strategies I think that you can use in training is basically saying, like, well, okay, well, if I know that doing this exercise is going to favor this head of the biceps or the triceps or the deltoid or whatever it is, I know that I'm basically going to start running into a performance and a fatigue limitation in that exercise when that portion of the muscle is pretty cooked, and I will not have accumulated the stimulatory volume in the adjacent things, even if they're somewhat involved. So then I can strategically pick other exercises that work those other regions, or a common thing is to use like the radiant principle, where it's just like, okay, to work my middle pecs, maybe I can work the upper and lower, and both of those have some overlapping effect on the sternal pec. And by doing that, I don't have to always do an exercise for every division of every muscle, but I can kind of strategically choose variations that either are more biased to a particular area I want to grow, or kind of are evenly spread out so I can get a whole muscle effect in as few exercises as possible.
I think that's really well explained. The thought that comes to mind as well, where it's like variation to be important, is another one where I think I commented on your post in regards to if people looked at the leg curl study and they were like, oh, seated leg curls cause more growth in the hamstrings. But when you dig into it, the sartorius, I believe it was, grew more in the lying leg curls. And that's one that got to a longer muscle length in the lying leg curls. And so people might look at that and be like, oh, I'm just going to do seated leg curls and never do lying. And that's probably the wrong way to think about it. But in addition to that, it's also a case of the hip hinge is something that everyone's going to be doing, where you're getting, again, a big stretch on the hamstrings there. And that's training them similarly to how maybe the leg curl is in some ways. So maybe if you combine lying with like a hip hinge, you get something very close to if you're doing the seated leg curl and a hip hinge as well. So it's like there's many things involved within these studies, and you can't just simply, like you said, you can't just take it out of context and be like, oh, this is the best exercise, therefore no more lying leg curls or something like those. And I think your point on variation is super important. So immediate example that comes to mind is like making sure you're doing, some deep squat patterns for quad growth, but complementing that with something like a leg extension to train the rec fem, which doesn't get well trained during the squat patterns there. So I think that's really key and important. One study that comes to mind actually outside of this is some people have thrown out, me included, because I have for years, and is seated calf raises. Because I've always focused on straight leg calf raises because that trains the gastroc and like the chunk of the muscle that's a bit more visible, and just based off the biomechanics of it, it's like, hey, I still get some soleus, whatever, but I'm really focused on the gastroc. So I just never really bothered with seated calf raises. And obviously we had that study that did come out, and it just showed how much superior straight leg variation seemed to be for the calf as a whole. Is that a scenario where you might consider, hey, maybe I wouldn't do too much seated calf work because it just seems we've just got this straight leg variation that does a better job overall?
I think this is a prime example where we have to look at what we saw in that leg extension study, where basically they worked both ranges of motion, and that also seemed to be fairly beneficial. So just because the straight-legged leg curl is significantly better than the seated bent knee calf raise,
yeah.
Right? So just because the straight leg calf raise was significantly better than a bent knee calf raise when you compare them directly, does not remove the possibility that there is some sort of complementary effect to them, right? Because did the straight or did the bent knee produce no hypertrophy? No, it didn't. It still produced some. And then there's the argument of like, well, but there's also varying degrees in between that too. So the amount that you can dorsiflex, okay, with a bent knee is usually more than you can with a straight knee, because when your knee is straight, basically you're running into the stretch in the calf. Okay. When you bend that, the calf shorts a little because it's a knee flexor, which means that we can stretch the soleus a little bit more, but it's not a huge difference. But what you have to consider is like, well, what if somebody is doing a lot of these stretches for the gastroc with the straight knee, or they're training in that way? Do we start closing the gap between those? And then it becomes like, well, actually I can reach the same degree of dorsiflexion with the straight knee because I've actually adapted the gastroc length to be able to be the same length. Like, so there's all these things of like, well, I don't know, like maybe in somebody that had a huge range of motion difference, they would have saw a significant benefit to the soleus doing it also bent knee. But maybe somebody that has very little difference see almost no benefit to doing the other, because they're essentially getting the same range of motion in the soleus in both exercises in those conditions. So there's still so much to consider before we can just say, hey, this is absolutely the best. I think knowing that in the 1-to-1, one is favored. If you were going to only do one, for sure, that's the one that you would do. I just don't know that we should be so confident that we throw that out altogether. So my compromise is like, hey, if I'm focusing on hypertrophy, I'm going to bias a greater percentage of my volume focusing on lengthened biased exercises, whether that's within program or through periodization, right? But I'm not going to completely neglect the short positions because there's a whole bunch of stuff that we don't know about whether they're complementary, about whether there's regional things, but because sometimes, like when we're comparing exercises, the difference isn't explicitly the range of motion. It could be range of motion, and it's also a little bit of an angle or a different motor pattern, et cetera. And so we can't necessarily just say, hey, only this one or not that one, when there's more that separates those exercises than just the range of motion. And if we go back to your hinge example versus like, okay, if I'm hinging versus I'm doing the leg curl, we have all the muscular stuff to consider. If I hinge, well, I don't train the short head of the biceps femoris. So basically that muscle gets zero stimulus from a hinge, right? But all of the hamstrings get it from a leg curl. So should I do more leg curls for hamstrings than hinges? But at the same time, the hinge is working at a different joint. So my guess would be there's a very regional difference in the hamstring growth of a hinge than a leg curl. So is that a reason to do both seated and hinge and do the lengthened of both? Because that might be similar, and also leg curls are also going to train some of the gastroc. There's all these things to consider. But if we want to simplify that, we can also look at like, what if the lying leg curl machine that you have has a really lengthened bias resistance challenge, and the seated leg curl you have is actually harder in the short position? It could be that in that instance, the lying leg curl would be a better lengthened exercise because it's actually challenging there versus your seated leg curl that is essentially light at the bottom or light at the top and easy at the bottom. Or maybe this is a prime application of utilizing partials or pauses and things like that to offset the resistance challenge. So I think that there are so many options and this is so complex, but that really what you need to do is you just need to figure out what goals you want to accomplish in a program and then try and accomplish those with your exercise selection and training technique. And then you need to move those goals based off of the results. I don't think we have, I think we're very far away from the evidence that we need to know how to mix and match and pair all of these exercises, at least from a research evidence-based standpoint, right? We have some principles that we can apply. Maybe we bias the lengthen more. Maybe we know certain exercises target certain subgroups and things like that more. Maybe we know from a programming thing that there's certain variables that we want to layer on top of these things, or there's certain technique changes that we can use to overcome limitation in exercise. We apply all of those things. But I don't think that we have firm answers of should you just do the standing calf raise or the straight leg calf raise. And I think that's why there is a lot of pushback by a lot of people on the community to some of the way this information is presented, right? Is it seems like, oh, throw out this and do this, or this is, 8 million% more hypertrophy than this or whatever, based off of a study. And maybe it's not the right population. It's just single exercise comparison with those. So there's not near as much caution, I don't think, that should be used. But of course, caution is not going to get you the clicks and engagement, that you're going for on social media. So I think that's a fine line between trying to get the information out there, but then also trying to actually deliver that information in the context that is going to actually, we'll say, be accurate or truthful to represent what we actually do know and can be confident about at this point.
I think that's really well said. And I think I like that you aren't throwing out tools. That's often something I think about in regards to the discussion of rep ranges. I know there's been people that have said like, hey, above this certain rep range, there's just no point, and there's all these cons, and they haven't considered any potential benefits there. It's like, hey, we just don't have enough research to throw out that tool of, hey, we know it can work. And for some people, they really like it. And we have some other ideas of why it seems to be beneficial. And it could even lead to some pathways of hypertrophy that we're not getting from the heavier rep ranges. So similarly here, like you said, maybe there's something to the short position we just haven't identified yet. To rule it out completely maybe isn't wise. Keep a little bit in there. Yes, it does seem training at a longer muscle length is something you want to focus on. And then obviously you mentioned variety being important. Training the functions, all the functions of various muscles at times is a good idea too. But like past that point, context is like a big key, and just the art of programming and data collection. And let's wait for more research and evidence to give us stronger answers. But yeah, definitely avoid that dogmatic black and white thinking. Don't jump to conclusions based off abstracts, research titles, or like, what's it called? An infographic that someone's posted out there. Like, take some time to think a bit about it a bit more deeply. And so, yeah, I highly appreciate yourself, Kaz, for doing that. So yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything else on this topic that you kind of wanted to update your stance on, or anything you wanted to add to what I said there, but I think you've done a great job of demonstrating some of the limitations of this study that people should be aware of, and just the range of motion research in general.
Yeah. I just think the barrier for this topic to most people is just simply understanding the quality of exercises so that they can use them appropriately. And, I think if you're going to be a lifelong trainer, that's definitely something that's worthwhile. Like is start learning enough about exercise that you kind of know a bit of why you would choose one over the other, right? From a principle standpoint, and not depend, because the research is not going to tell you what exercises to use for every body part to maximize hypertrophy anytime soon. We're just not going to get to that point, right? Like, there is not going to be a completely evidence-based hypertrophy program that has a justification for all of the exercises and the combinations and the order they're in and all of that. It's so far away. So you have to just learn enough of those foundational principles that you can just simply make educated, guesses about, like, hey, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. This fits that. What else should I include? Is this thing too similar, or is it different in a way that complements it? Sometimes you want two similar things, and you only want them to differ by, one variable, like range of motion or resistance challenge or something, because you're really honed in on that area. And other times you want them to be very different because what you're trying to do is spread out the stimulus, right? And so if you know that, you can really kind of just make better principled decisions. And I think our principles are good enough that even if you aren't doing things perfectly, you're going to be getting the majority of the results. But I do see a lot of people that probably are missing out on a lot if they're doing things without understanding any of these fundamentals, because, like, sometimes they'll literally be doing the same movement pattern in 3 different places in the gym, right? Which means that basically all they're doing is that each time they start a new exercise, they're just doing it at a lower performance because of the fatigue from the previous exercise. And they're not really there's nothing different about this new exercise, right? Like, a common place you'll see this is like in pressing, right? Is people like, well, I did dumbbell presses, then I did barbell presses, and I did machine presses. And they're basically doing the same press in 3 different chairs, right? And that's not what I would call, very strategic programming for most people. They probably would be better off doing something that was varying those exercises in a way that fits their goals a little bit more, whether that's doing, hey, I'm going to do the same arm path, but I'm going to do one thing that's focused on the stretch, one thing that's focused on the short, right? Or one thing that's a pressing motion, one thing that's a flying motion. I'm going to flip up that motor pattern, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think drawing it back to the principles is key. Not looking at research papers and trying to copy that. It's as bad as copying a program off an elite bodybuilder and expecting it to grow you the best way. Try and draw it back to principles. And like you said, try and avoid redundancies, have a basic understanding of anatomy, biomechanics, so that you aren't falling into some of those traps. And that's going to take you a long way if you put and apply effort towards that. So really well said. And if people want to keep up to date with what you're putting out, I've already given your Instagram a shout out, but definitely shout that out. Anything going on at N1 that you want to share that people might be interested in, Kaz?
Well, we actually do have a substantial update coming to our training site that will include an application, which we're very much looking forward to. It's our second attempt at it over the last 4 or 5 years or whatnot. And there's a ton of stuff that's out there, but if you're familiar with what we do in terms of, talking about either being able to bias ranges of motion or different divisions of muscle and stuff like that, this is going to be a kind of a unique tool in that it's essentially going to allow the app to do a lot of the work for you, in terms of choosing substitution exercises and things like that, where it's not just like, hey, I don't have a hack squat, so what should I do? And it's just like, oh, well, here's other things that have squat in the name, or other things that are quad exercises. What it's actually going to do is really inform you on exercises that are the most similar from a range of motion, biomechanics, resistance challenge, right? And kind of like help you make better substitutions, exercise pairing, and stuff like that. So we're building in a lot of freedom in our programs, knowing that the majority of our audience is a little bit more advanced, but also knowing that, like, hey, when people need to substitute things, we want to be as close to a coach being able there to give them, and in many instances, probably I would say, we'll say better than a coach, and that, like, how big is your library on the spot for, like, hey, I don't have this. What can you do? You'll have an answer, but it could be like just the thing that comes first to your mind. It's not a complex analysis of you comparing every possible exercise and saying, actually, of the 22 options or whatever that you could use, these 3 are the most close to what this original exercise was trying to accomplish, right? So that's in testing now. So hopefully, in November sometime, we should be, releasing at least at least to a small group of people, the application there. So the
That's
N1
exciting.
app will be a reality soon. And I think people that like the nuance, like applying nuance to training, will see this as the first tool that actually allows you to apply nuance to training, right? Like everything from like tracking drop sets and partials and whatever, and getting kind of a relative volume according to those things, stuff like that. So basically it's meant to essentially handle the actual programs that we would write.
Nice. That's exciting. So you said that's going to be released around November time. So that is Christmas come early for some people. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people listening to it. Very excited to try that one out. Is that going to be, do you know a rough ballpark of like how expensive that might be, or is there like a year, like
yes,
people can subscribe
so
to?
there will be a monthly and a year price. I should have these. I probably should have had these in front of me if I was going to talk it. I think it's around a $40 a month price is what it can start, and I can't remember what the year is, but it's a substantial discount to sign up for the year. So I mean, essentially, what we always try and do is provide higher quality at a lower price than what we can find competitively, in the market. So. For sure, I think, if this stuff interests you, it will deliver the value. If you're just looking for X's and O's, then yeah, it will not be the app for you if you don't apply any nuance in training and you just like, I want a spreadsheet that says squats 5 sets, bench 5 sets, or choose favorite elbow flexion exercise here, and those are legit. Like this is some of what we see, in terms of not just apps, but also programming from coaches and stuff like that. So it is going to be something that allows you to do that. And of course, it's built on top of our database of, hey, here's exactly how to perform these exercises and stuff as well. So you're actually getting, what the program intends. You're not doing Bayesian curls that aren't challenging in the lengthened position or are upright rows behind the body.
Yes, sure. Cool. Yeah, that sounds great. I think people are going to really enjoy that. I'm excited to see how that launch goes for you guys. And like I said, are you your coach _Kassem? I'm going to have it linked in the description anyway. So whenever people talk those through, they just search for this link anyway. So I'll make sure that's linked there, and I'll make sure your website's linked there, which I guess the website will be where people can find the app, or will it be searchable by that point?
I believe it should be searchable by both, but you will purchase the app through the website, I think, regardless. Okay. Right. So it'll be on not our education platform, which is where our courses are, but our training platform. So N1.training.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, I'll make sure that's all linked up. And again, thank you so much, Kassem, for your time and for just being and taking the role that you do within the space. I think it's really valuable, and I think it's going to help people make better training decisions. So thank you again. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll catch you soon.
Thank you.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though, it's reality and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut Movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut Movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.